Welcome to the Perspective Knoll. Here we launch chapters once a week from original stories and occasionally other creative videos. Feel free to like and subscribe.
Chapter 16. The South Gate. When they reached the lower level, Charles found himself standing in a narrow hallway, and on either side were doors that led to the prisoners. It was quiet, and there was the smell of rotting food or worse from one of the cells. Thaddeus led on, and they made their way past 4 doors on either side. Charles realized that these were not normal cells, with bars and a huge lock to hold back criminals. Instead, there were white rooms with no bars and a window on the door so that they could be observed through. Charles had felt that he was walking through an asylum of sorts instead of a prison. "This is how your prisons look here in this world." Thaddeus looked at Charles with a hint of surprise. "Not sure how the rest of the world builds theirs, but it's standard here in the West. The windows on the doors allow us to see what the victim is up to. These doors aren't thin either, thick steel infused with wood oak and leaves from a walnut tree. If you're not sure what that is, they have the largest and thickest leaves of any tree on the planet, and they can only be found on the northwestern coast of the Amolic Sea." Thaddeus seemed proud to know what his cells were made of, and the ingredients only made him twice as giddy. "The whole room is lined the same way as the door. The walnut leaf is really good at suppressing the noise from within the rooms. Oh, and a bit of magic makes it so the leaf does not die." Thaddeus stopped by a door on the left and peered into the window. "Ah, here we are." He tapped the glass and waved at the person inside. Charles then stepped forward to get a look, and sure enough, sitting in the corner of the room that was almost bare was the thin, bald man known as William Presentpint. William acknowledged them and gave Charles a suspicious look. "Okay, lawman, I'll be right here with the door shut," explained Thaddeus as he reached in his pants pocket for the key. "Whoa, so I'm going to be in there alone? Do you have a guard down here that can assist me should things get physical?" Charles was trying to remind Thaddeus of protocol instead of him being just plain worried. Then he thought the protocol in this world would surely not be the same as his own. Thaddeus again was surprised by the words Charles was spitting out. "I think you doubt my capabilities. Just know that I've got you covered. Now remember, ask him about his father and his location. If he complies with that, then we can agree on his release." "I thought you wanted the servants of Errol to leave Jordan's post alone for good?" asked Charles, reminding Thaddeus of what he had told him nearly minutes ago. "Well, that too, but if you can get nothing else but the location of his father, then that's a start. We can get his whole clan on the run," Thaddeus replied, and Charles could tell that the servants of Errol had really been a thorn in his side for far too long. Charles took in a deep breath and entered the room. As stated earlier, as soon as Charles passed through the threshold, the door closed behind him. William studied Charles and rather curiously. He picked up a sheet of paper and crumbled it up and tossed it across the room. Charles took a few steps and grabbed the paper and opened it. There was a picture drawn on it, and it was of a man holding a baby, and at his feet was a black hole. "Is this something you've been doing to pass the time in here?" asked Charles as he placed the sketch into his pocket. "It's merely a message detective, or should I say lawman," William answered, and he was still sitting down with his arms resting on his knees and his back against the wall. "It's what I dreamt about last night, and before I went to sleep, I prayed to Errol to give me a sign of what I should do next." "So, he wants you to place an infant into a hole? Sounds vague. Would any hole do, or any infant?" Charles asked, and he stepped backwards towards the wall where the door was and leaned on it. "That's not a hole," William smirked and sat up. "It's a portal. I figure you were thinking that the person holding the child was standing up, but no, the person is lying down. You see, it's a double sacrifice. The baby was only ever the one we needed to get Errol to come back to us. But in my dream, he is not pleased with my failure and has requested an additional sacrifice to be made." "Me? You? Why not any other of your goons? Is it because you were the one who summoned him or tried to summon him and failed?" Charles asked with curiosity. "That's exactly why," William had answered. He feels that I may partake in the ritual once more and tells me that I can still summon him as long as I am holding the child. William seemed more at peace than anything as the words were leaving his mouth. And to answer your other question, yes. It must be the same child as before. Charles allowed that bit of information to soak in, and then an irritating fact entered his mind. If William was willing to sacrifice himself for some god, then he might not be interested in his freedom if he is already willing to die. So, giving up his father in any way may not be in the cards. Tell me about your father. Why? William seemed to change from that peaceful man to one who was about to get enraged from just mentioning his own father. Well, from what I hear, he was the one who got you all hot and bothered about Errol in the first place. I know he has many other servants under his command, and in fact, he was the one who created the servants of Errol. Is that all true? Charles had folded his arms and waited for a response. Maybe, said William as he got to his feet, stood up straight, and narrowed his eyes on Charles. My father was never a good man. Well, not to me. I left his care long before I was a man. I returned when I heard from others that he was harboring people who felt as though they didn't belong anywhere. So, I came back to him and vowed to make him proud. That's all a son ever wants, isn't it? So, he gave me some tasks and I've done my best to carry them out. Okay, so your father was not the best dad in the world. He didn't hug you enough, right? Charles felt like that last jab was a bit too much and he could tell it struck a nerve with William. Sorry about that last part. Look, your dad was mean, so what changed him? Just like me in my dream last night, he was too visited by Errol and claimed that it was time to give him a vessel to continue his work upon Lufforain, William answered. Apparently, he awoke the next morning with a renewed spirit and he felt as though his deeds to come would cleanse the bad deeds of his past. Was he ever a church-going man? Did he feel any connection with Errol prior to this vision or dreams? Charles asked. As far as I knew, he did not respect the five. He never took me to church, nor did I ever once hear him pray, William answered, and Charles could tell that he was beginning to calm down. Do you have a mother? I did, she left when I was young. I was still too young to walk, as my father tells it. In my heart, that's why I think he got so bitter. Maybe it was my presence that always reminded him of her, and that's why he wanted nothing to do with me most of the time, William answered and then cocked his head and asked. Do you have any children, lawman? Charles took a deep breath and knew that William was looking for more trust. Charles felt that William was being truthful with his answers, so he needed to return the kindness. Yes, I had a son once. He was great. My wife and I loved him very much and we always gave him the things he wanted. Well, that's not true. One time he had asked for a trampoline from Santa when he was about 10 years old. Santa is a very special man back where I come from, a very magical man. Anyways, he was disappointed when he found no trampoline on Christmas morning. But we couldn't get one of those anyways. At that time, we were living in an apartment. It was just a boy's wish. William looked over Charles and clearly judged to see if he was telling the truth or not. You said you had a son, what happened to him? Charles cleared his throat, and he wasn't ever ready to tell others about his son, especially random criminals. He died in a car crash. A drunk driver nailed him head-on. I turned to drinking for a long while. I began to ignore my wife's presence and one day, I found myself alone and with nothing. I turned to God and began rebuilding my life. For myself and for the memory of my son too. His name was Larry. His best friend from Oregon State was Shawn Harken and I have kept in close contact with him over the last few years. Believe it or not, Shawn is here, well somewhere in the forest. Charles finished and there was a large lump in his throat and his eyes were tearing up and threatening to release them upon his cheeks. William too had cloudy eyes as Charles finished and there was clearly some sympathy for him. He looked down and scratched his stomach and sighed. I sometimes think my father is full of shit, William began as he was still looking down at the floor. I think that he never got a message from Errol. That the god never told him how to conduct rituals. I wish it wasn't true, but as you yourself have seen lawman, it works. There is something on the other side wanting in. Charles had remembered that day in Nemo's bait and how Errol was nearly through into this world. Then he had a thought and asked. How do you know that's Errol himself, who's trying to come in from the other side? How does your father know? A dream? If I was in your shoes, man, I would want more proof than just a dream and his word alone. William said nothing but only slumped back down to the ground and began crying. To Charles, William seemed conflicted, as if what Charles was hearing was something that William had been telling himself all along. The very questions that Charles had asked is something that William contemplates daily. Yet surely, he only wants the approval of his father, and no matter what age someone becomes, that is something that will never go away. Look, William, I can help you, Charles began, and he took a few steps towards the still weeping William. I can get you out of here and away from the servants of Errol. All I ask for is that you tell me where your father is. Tell me of his hideout so that we can stop this madness, and so that whatever he plans on unleashing on this world can be nothing more than a failed experiment. William wiped his eyes and looked up at Charles. He composed himself and replied, I can't give up my father. William then looked back down. I love my father, lawman, and I will not turn him in. I won't see him killed. At least not in the way that could be traced back to me that gave him up. I just won't. I can give you a location but not a pinpoint. That's fine, William, anything will do, and we'll get you out of here. Charles then knelt down beside him and leaned in close to hear the intel. He's hiding in there. William began to cry again, and Charles leaned in just a little more. That's when William smiled and eyed Charles wildly. You're dumber than I thought. You really believed I was going to give up my father? Then William lunged forward and grabbed Charles by the arm and then punched him in the stomach with his free hand. Everything happened so fast that Charles never saw it coming. The punch took the air right out of him, and he felt as though he had never been hit so hard in his life. Charles fell backwards with the weight of William falling on him. William then pulled his fist back again and struck Charles in the face. There was a ringing in his ears now, and he felt as though his cheekbone on his left side had just cracked. William brought his hand back once more, and just before he swung his fist down, he went flying off Charles and to the ground. Charles then noticed that Thaddeus was now in the room and holding a weapon in his hands that resembled a crossbow. Charles heard another noise that was unfamiliar, but he guessed that it was coming from the weapon. He looked at William, who now had 2 short arrows sticking out of his chest. Thaddeus bent down and helped Charles back to his feet and aided him out of the room. They made their way back up the stairs, and Thaddeus dumped Charles off in his chair behind his desk. By the Creator, Charles, I knew he wouldn't be straight with us, said Thaddeus in a rage, and he tossed the crossbow across his desk. Damn. This isn't going to end well. Charles had a throbbing face and a pain in his stomach that made it hard to focus on anything. Give me a second, he managed to say as he slouched in the chair and looked up at the ceiling. It took several minutes for Charles to regain himself, and he sat back up in the chair and took in a deep breath. How are you doing? Thaddeus asked. Well, it hurts. That guy packed one hell of a punch. Damn, Charles felt the side of his face, and just the slightest touch was painful. So, is William dead? Oh yeah, said Thaddeus gravely. I had no choice. It was him or you, and I did not want the death of the latest lawman to come from my town. Thaddeus scratched his head and then began talking to Shaylee. Hey, I will clean up the mess in cell 06. Don't mention anything to anyone. If one of the cultists of Errol is one of my guards, I'd prefer that they didn't know we just killed their leader's son. I'll think of something to tell everyone once I calm down, some lie, that he either escaped or I moved him. Damn it, I'll think of something. Is that clear, Shaylee? No mention to anyone. Shaylee gave Thaddeus a stern head nod and went back to writing on the piece of paper that she had already been writing on. How much of that interrogation do you think he made up? Asked Charles. Thaddeus shrugged his shoulder. Could have been every last word, but then again, it's hard for anyone to cry like that on command. It had me fooled, that's why it took me a moment to get in there and save you. Well, it was worth a try, but in the end, we got nothing. I'm not so sure, Thaddeus. I believe that drawing he showed me is genuine, and his explanation was the truth. Charles then pulled the piece of crumpled paper out from his pocket and handed it to Thaddeus. So, you believe that Errol gave him a vision to sacrifice himself as a sign of good faith? Thaddeus laughed. Well, he's dead now, so Errol can't get what he wants to enter Lufforain. Don't be so sure. Charles had a growing feeling of dread. You said it yourself, there could be someone in your guard who could be a cultist and may have been talking with William behind your back. To the point that a message could get back to his father, and from there, they could figure out how to go on with the plan. Charles had hung his head low. I need to keep moving. I didn't want to stay here in Jordan's Post for too long. Myself and my friends are on our way to the Western Kingdom. Thaddeus stared at Charles with a look of disappointment. All right. I think that would be a good idea considering if you are right about getting a message out. I believe that Randall Presentpint is already on his way and all of us here in Jordan's Post will soon feel his wrath. Charles stood up and walked over to the front door, still rubbing his stomach where he got punched. Best of luck to you, town manager. Wait, before you go, Thaddeus made his way over to a cabinet behind his desk and what he pulled from it was another crossbow. He walked back over to Charles and grinned. This is a crossbow. You've seen one before, right? Yeah, in movies, Charles answered. Movies? Thaddeus asked as if Charles was speaking in another language. Never mind, yes, I have seen one. Charles thought it was best to keep his answers simple. Good. So, most crossbows work by someone pulling back on the serving string until it catches the latch. Then you put your arrow or dart in the flight groove and wait to shoot at something. So that's the basics. This crossbow is not any of that. This one comes from the northern kingdom of Gorferndain. Charles began to study the weapon more closely and found out that this was no normal crossbow. It looked like one that he would find back home at some firing range. Yet there was a complexity about it that made his mind wonder how it worked. You see this gem right here on either side of the handle? Well, those are infused with magical properties. These gems allow the crossbow to fire and reload without the user doing it themselves. See, the arrows are located under the limbs on both sides. Charles noticed that there were 6 small arrows on either side of the crossbow. So, if you hold it in your hand and pull the trigger once, as Thaddeus did so, an arrow from the right side slid into the flight path and then the serving string pulled itself back and was ready. It made a hissing sound and the mechanical clanking of small gears turned and Charles saw that the arrows on one side of the bow slid over. That's incredible! Charles said excitedly. It loads itself and after every shot, the arrows slide inward to ready for the next one. It must be by a spring. I'd love to have one of these. Yeah, well, take it then, said Thaddeus quickly. No, I can't take this thing. Charles began to protest. Look, I already have one of my own. It's the same thing sitting on my desk, the same one that I put William down with. Now you're not a lawman unless you have an intimidating weapon, and believe me, Charles, that one scares the crap out of most folks. Charles took the weapon and placed it in his hands and wasn't sure how to thank Thaddeus for the gift. Look, head over to Milton's place, just across the road and near the bend. He'll set you up with a way to carry that and have some more ammo. Tell him Thaddeus town manager sent you. Thank you. I really mean that. Charles felt as though he could have given Thaddeus a hug but knew better not to. Look, I do need to get going. Where did you say you and your group were headed? Asked Thaddeus as he made his way back to his desk and returned his crossbow back into the cabinet. South Gate of the Western Kingdom, Charles answered. Thaddeus paused and studied Charles. Be careful over there. War is coming for them. You might not be able to get in the city at this time. Do you have to go? If anyone can help me get Shawn back from Jolene, apparently a psycho witch, then I was told the king and queen would be more than willing. Thaddeus nodded and waved at Charles as he walked out of the building and investigated the square and breathed in deep. Charles saw people walking about and a few kids were tossing a ball around. A couple that was leaving the inn noticed Charles and waved happily at him. He smiled in return but quickly stopped because it hurt his cheek so much to make a facial expression like that. Charles entered the inn and found Anthony, Harmon, and Laurie having a conversation with a short man who looked more like a dwarf than anything. The man introduced himself as Drendat and indeed was a dwarf and that he had come from the southern edge of the forest, and was looking for his brother named Drendis. The conversation didn't last long because Laurie was far too concerned about what happened to Charles' face. Charles of course told them everything that happened and what was said, well as best as he could remember. Even the dwarf was stroking his long beard that almost touched the ground during Charles' tale. Drendat was wearing full plate armor. and there was a sigil on his chest that were two double-sided hammers tipped over a large anvil that sat in between them. "It's the sigil of my clan," said Drendat. "We don't believe in gods, new or old. They aren't here now, so what does it matter? We are known for our crafting. Our sigil is known as Hammers of Crulian Forge. To be honest, I've always wanted some armor of my own," began Anthony, and Charles cleared his throat and then pointed to his own wrist as if indicating it was time to go. "Some other time, Drendat. Best of luck to you in finding your brother. And to you as well on your travels." Drendat turned and left the inn at a fast pace, and before they knew it, he was out of sight. They all headed down the road to Milton's, the place where Thaddeus insisted on getting a carrier for the new weapon and more arrows. Anthony had Lufforain currency that he had retrieved from his parents' house in the woods to pay for a pair of short daggers for Laurie. They were told by Milton that the southern gate was a good day's walk from Jordan's Post. So, the group decided to stay the night at the inn and the next morning ventured further north and towards the southern gate. It was nearly nightfall when they began to see the structure through the trees. At first, they saw only the tower itself that served as a vantage point for the guards that patrolled the upper levels. It was a stone-made structure that was a good 3 stories tall, and at either side of the 2 large doors were mounted turrets that looked like ballistae. "Oh my God, is that the castle?" asked Laurie, and for a moment, Charles wanted to answer yes, it was simply massive. "Unfortunately, not," answered Anthony, and he kept walking as he took the lead. Laurie and Charles had stopped when they reached the road, and the wall itself stood about a quarter-mile away. "This is the southern gate. The city itself is more than a mile inward. I was told that the wall keeps the catapults out of range of the city. And the wall is damn sturdy itself. Wow, I would never have thought I would be able to see something like this in person," Laurie began again, and this time, she managed to pick up her feet and keep moving. "I've wanted to see the Colosseum in Rome or the Church of Notre Dame. If this is just the wall, then I can't imagine how beautiful the castle looks." "Oh, it's something all right," said Harmon. He still had the portrait on his back, and he was getting a little irritated with the way the ropes were rubbing his sides that were holding it on him. As they got closer to the gate, Charles could tell that there were about a half-dozen guards gathered around it. All of them were looking right at them as they slowly approached. Charles wondered if the crossbow would send a threatening message and had half a mind to try and hide it or toss it in the grass next to the road. But they were too close now, and such suspicious behavior could raise an alarm. "So, remember, it's wartime for the Western Kingdom, so they will question us why we are here," said Anthony as he slowed his pace to speak mainly to Charles but still loud enough for Laurie and Harmon to hear. "Just tell them we are seeking aid to find a friend who was taken by a sorceress." "Well, that's the truth, isn't it?" asked Charles as he marveled at the sight of the wall that arced from either side of the gate and stretched as far as the eye could see. "Should we mention we are from Earth?" "No." Anthony was surprised that Charles had suggested such a thing. "They might see that as a scam. Like we could be the enemy posing as travelers from Earth in hopes that they would simply open the gates to us and then, bing bada boom, behind enemy lines. So, avoid saying Earth at all, Charles." "Fair enough," Charles answered. Now they made it within 50 feet of the gate, and that's when 2 guards had pulled out swords and were ready for a fight. Charles, Anthony, Laurie, and Harmon stopped immediately. The pair of guards moved forward with their swords still pointed at them. Their uniforms were colored mostly blue and white with yellow accents. Embroidered on their chest was a white-colored, 4-sided diamond appearing to be shining over a large tree. The clothing looked like it was leather, and they wore a hat that was big and furry and looked as if they stole the idea from the Russians' winter bomber. "State your business," said the one guard on the right. Both men were young and yet seemed strong enough to handle even the likes of Harmon on their own, and yet 4 more still stood at the ready by the wall. Anthony had stepped forward to take the lead of the conversation. "We are travelers from Jordan's Post. We would like to seek the counsel of King Uriel and Queen Memphia." Anthony did not dare take another step forward or make any unnecessary movements. "Have you been living in a cave or something? We are at war here. No one sees the king or queen, better yet, no one enters the gates unless given permission," said the same guard as before. "Look, our friend was taken captive by a sorceress of the woods. Who knows what may have happened to him? Please let us speak to someone. Hell, what about you men, can you spare any of your—" Anthony was interrupted harshly. "Ha! "You will never have any of these men nor I," said the other guard, and that's when he caught a glimpse of Charles' crossbow. "What's the need to be traveling so armed, sir?" Charles felt like a deer in the headlights. Panic took him, and before he could fumble over his words, Laurie answered for him. "It's for protection," she said simply. "It's a big forest, filled with tons of creatures that can harm you, and if you weren't paying attention, the other member of our party, my husband, was kidnapped from us. Maybe if we had that crossbow at the time he was taken, then he would still be with us." "All right, fair enough, lady, but look. No one comes in unless authorized, nor do they get aid," explained the guard on the right. "We can have a letter sent to the castle and wait for an answer, but in these times, it would be hard to get access otherwise. So, send a letter." Laurie spoke with a tone like a busy mother scolding her children that were not minding her. The pair of guards looked at one another and took a few steps back to have a private conversation. Moments later, the one on the left asked, "What would you like it to read?" Laurie gave a smile and kept her words short and to the point. Anthony and Charles both were very impressed by her willingness to take charge. The guards left them where they stood and told them that it could be a while until an answer came, and that they might want to think about setting up a campsite before they run out of daylight.